Welcome, everybody. I think we're going to start the program. Thank you for coming out tonight. We have a wonderful speaker. We have two speakers, and it's a really important topic. I will introduce our speaker. I am Karen Cohen with the CCHS Parents Association. We have a speaker series throughout the year. We bring different speakers in. We have envelopes over there for those who would like to donate to the organization so that we can continue bringing these kind of programs. So I will introduce our speaker. We have Eden Evans here today. She's an MD, MPH. She's the founding director of the Center for Addiction Medicine at Mass General Hospital and Cox Family Associate Professor of Psychiatry in the field of addiction medicine at Harvard Medical School. She has a master's degree in public health with a concentration in clinical effectiveness from the Harvard School of Public Health. She has authored several articles, book chapters, and reviews concerning topics in this field, and she is currently supported by 6 major grants looking at novel therapies for addictive disorders. She is here today with Jody Gilman, who is a PhD, an NIH-trained neurobiologist and director of neuroscience at the MGH Center for Addiction Medicine. And together with their team, they are studying the effects of nicotine, marijuana, and alcohol on the brain and on cognitive addiction disorders in adolescents and young adults. And just a little aside, I was fortunate enough to hear Dr. Evans speak for a group of psychologists and lawyers. And I remember sitting there with my colleagues and we were all saying, oh my God, this woman should come to every high school. I did not know at that time that she actually lived in Concord and her daughter is a sophomore here at the school. So when I found that out, I contacted her and she was happy to do this, and we are so fortunate. And it is a small world. So thank you again, and let's get going.
Thank you so much. Thanks for being here, 7 o'clock on a school night. Everybody's been at work, and I've already been to saxophone lessons and made supper. So anyway, thanks for being here. I'd be happy to take questions throughout, because that way I'll know that I'm addressing what you're interested in. So these are the questions I want to address today. Is youth marijuana, nicotine, or alcohol use harmful? So I want to really focus on use in the teen brain, which is what we were asked to talk about. So the big questions really are, what are the effects on the brain? Does age of initiation matter? And if so, how and why? What are the effects on cognition, on IQ, on ability to learn? What's the relationship with mental illness? And does increased availability essentially lead to increased use and increased addiction? So these are the questions I'll try to touch on. First with cannabis, and then tobacco, and then with alcohol. And so basically peak age of first diagnosis is between age 16 and 19 for all of these disorders. So we don't do a very good job of keeping our kids safe. That's really been a topic for broader national conversation for the past couple of weeks, but here just in terms of exposure to addictive drugs. So cannabis. It's marijuana. It contains over 400 chemical compounds in varying concentrations, most of which are psychoactive or active in the brain. The intoxicating agent is called THC, and THC is a compound that acts on specific molecular targets on brain cells called cannabinoid receptors. And these receptors are specifically important in development because they are activated by chemicals in the brain similar to THC. One of the ones I'll talk about is called anandamide. And they're part of a neural communication network called the endocannabinoid system. And this plays an important role in normal brain development and function. And this may underlie some of the apparent increased vulnerability to the effects of cannabis in young people, and particularly high-potency cannabis in young people. So you'll hear a refrain that high potency is, the higher the potency, the worse the problems can be, and the earlier the onset of use, the worse the problems can be. So this is essentially the reward region. We'll talk about that in terms of addiction. And then this system here involved in memory. And then back here, this system that's involved in control of movement, which is important for operating motor vehicles and things such as that. So there's a brain chemical called anandamide, which is one of the key actors in the endocannabinoid system. And you can see it looks very much like THC, and that's sort of how drugs of abuse work. They mimic neurotransmitters in the brain, and that way function in the body. So when marijuana is inhaled, THC rapidly passes from the lungs into the bloodstream, which carries this chemical THC to the brain and other organs throughout the body. If THC or cannabis is ingested in food or drink, it's a much more slow process. So the endocannabinoid system has a critical role in adolescent brain development. And it shapes brain development by guiding neurons to grow into the right places into the brain for correct function. And it sort of modulates or controls neuronal activity, which works to affect brain wiring. I don't know if you've heard neurons that fire together, wire together. So in modulating neuronal activity, it really controls some of the physical characteristics that the brain brings into adulthood, essentially. It also supports myelin growth on neurons. And why is this important? So the brain is changing dramatically through about age 25. So myelination is happening in the sort of back to front pattern. So there's also cortical development that's going on, as well as pruning. So if you don't sort of use it or lose it in the brain, so the neurons that are working and are connecting together get reinforced, and those that are less used do get pruned. So what's happening in adolescence is quite important, and I think that's partly why this is a vulnerable period for addiction and for cognitive impact of drugs on the brain. So I've talked about THC and anandamide. That's the brain's chemical that functions in the cannabinoid system. And both sort of function to essentially modulate neuronal activity and change neurotransmitter release. But THC has a stronger effect than anandamide, and it lasts for longer. So essentially, it takes away the selectivity of anandamide. So essentially floods the system and can obscure the natural signals between neurons. So in the presence of THC, particularly if it's there a lot of the time or all the time, anandamide really can't do its job to protect and balance neuronal activity that's critical in development. So anybody who's in my generation and thinks they know sort of what it's like to smoke pot because they smoked some grass in college, what was around when I was in college and when many of you are in college is nothing like what's available today in terms of potency. So the amount of THC or the potency of THC has been shown to be quite important. And this is data that was published just a couple of years ago showing essentially the potency of seized cannabis throughout the country. So it's sort of an average of what's out there. And this is just leaf marijuana. So, it was about 2.5%, 3% when I was in college. It's now about 18% on average. And that's just leaf cannabis. So this is now a 10-year-old slide. I couldn't find anything more recent to show potency of the sort of higher quality cannabis or higher THC cannabis or hashish. So essentially you can see doubling, quadrupling of the potency, and that doesn't even cover the high potency sort of oils or dabs that are available and are very, very much on the market in Colorado and Washington State, California.
Sorry, thanks. My question was when you were comparing and describing the difference between the drug and the brain chemical, seemed to suggest that the drug masked or suppressed the production of the brain chemical. And I was just interested to understand, A, if I was hearing it correctly, and then two, what effect that has on the body's natural production of that. Does it continue to diminish it so that it's hard to
I
restore?
understand your question. So it doesn't diminish production that I know of anandamide, but what because it floods the whole system, you can't have selective presence of anandamide in places that, in regions of the brain that you're using. So essentially, it becomes available globally, and you don't reinforce the parts of the brain that you're using. So the selectivity is lost because you're essentially flooding the system globally.
And that's only during the time that the drug is present? Does it resume back to normal operation? Okay.
As far as I know.
All right, thank you.
Yeah. So another major difference in cannabis now is the ratio of THC to CBD has changed remarkably. So CBD is cannabidiol. It's the compound that we're studying at Mass General for seizure disorders for kids. It's being tested in Europe as an antipsychotic. It probably has anxiolytic or anxiety-reducing properties, but there's very little CBD in cannabis now. What's present in much higher concentrations, or the ratio is much higher, is THC, and that's the intoxicating component of cannabis. So it's just quite different, and that sort of feeds into why we're so confused about marijuana use, and it's because we're really learning. What we know about marijuana is I guess it's growing rapidly, but some studies to date have reported detrimental effects of marijuana use, while others haven't. And why is that? I've listed just a few reasons here. The evidence in humans is mostly correlational. So mostly it's comparing kids who've used marijuana with kids who haven't, adults who have used for quite a long time with adults who haven't. And with those sorts of studies, it could be causal, it could be reverse causation. It could be that people who have poor cognitive function or more anxiety symptoms choose to use more cannabis. So that's one of the problems. We do have some animal studies, and that's more helpful because they're experimental in design, and you give the THC and you see the effects. So I'll show you those where they're there. Some of the differences that we see between users and non-users, say on cognitive tests, well, we don't really know necessarily real-world significance. So we're going out into the high schools around Greater Boston, and we're paying kids to quit smoking pot for a month, and we're measuring their ability to learn weekly for 4 weeks. And well, we are seeing cognition improve in these folks, but and it's worse at baseline. When they've been using, but is that enough? Is that enough to cause really functional impairment? So in our next studies, we really want to look at scholastic achievement, grades, that sort of thing. So, are these differences that we see, are they of real world significance? Studies of heavy marijuana users don't necessarily translate to people who use occasionally. And some of the older studies, when the marijuana was so much less potent, really may not translate to the studies, to the marijuana that's available today. So these are the areas of the brain that are quite affected by THC and where receptors are quite dense. So I'll talk a bit about memory, and this is the hippocampus. We're very rich in THC receptors. I'll talk about reward and addiction, so this region here. And I'll talk about sort of motor coordination and driving, as somebody whose daughter took driver's ed last week. It's very, very pertinent to kids. And I'll talk about evidence we have in kids or young people wherever it's available. I'll try to point out when it's not specific to kids, like all the driving data is really not specific to kids. So we'll start with looking at cannabis and cognition, and with just a synopsis. So animals that are exposed to THC during adolescence show changes in their brain. They show change in the shape of the hippocampus, which subserves memory. They show changes in some of the neurotransmitter systems in their brainstem, the serotonin and dopaminergic systems. And they show reduced cognitive flexibility in adulthood, reduced memory, object recognition, reduced social interaction, and some impulsivity. This is a slide just from Randy Schuster in our group, who's a amazing young neuropsychologist who's doing great work in adolescent and young adult memory and cognition as it relates to cannabis use. And essentially the variation that we see in effects of cannabis on cognition is related to duration of use, quantity of use, frequency, and particularly age of onset. And this is one of her first studies. We wanted to look and see if in a sample that Jody Gilman had collected for a different study, if we could see changes, differences based on age of onset of cannabis use. And so we divided the sample who had taken a memory test into early onset of cannabis use, so before age 17, late onset of use, and never users, the controls. And this is a simple test of trying to learn 16 words. So 16 words, and we repeat it 5 times. It's basically a shopping list of things from the hardware store and the grocery store and a clothes store. And so how many words did they remember after each repetition? And then there's a delay with the distraction, and the test was memory. And so many, many studies have shown impaired memory in cannabis users, but Randy had the idea that it may not be memory, that it really might be initial encoding or essentially learning that was abnormal. And lo and behold, that's what she found. So if you look here, yes, those who started marijuana use early had worse memory than those who started later, the controls. But it's traced all the way back to initially they learned fewer words at the first trial, and they never quite caught up. So they learned, they got improved at the same rate as the other groups, but they never caught up. So it's this initial learning that she's seeing is abnormal. This is a similar study, again, showing early onset versus late onset versus controls in samples that were matched for IQ, also for years of daily marijuana use, current use, lifetime consumption, and length of abstinence. And the ones who started using in their teen years had poor sustained attention, cognitive inhibition, and abstract reasoning. So these are examples of cross-sectional studies. Well, maybe these folks came into the world this way. Madeline Meyer, who's now at Duke, found this study from Dunedin, New Zealand, in which almost every kid, 98% of kids at birth were enrolled into this study, over 1,000 kids, and they were followed every 2 years until they were age 38. In fact, the age 55 data sets just come out and they're studying the kids now. But what she was able to look at was a very nice evaluation of IQ at age 13 before these kids had started using marijuana regularly. In fact, I think only 7 had ever tried marijuana at that age. And again, at age 38, so full-scale IQ, very nicely done. And then at frequent intervals, their marijuana use was evaluated. And this is sort of a complicated slide, but essentially, for those who had a diagnosis of marijuana dependence 3 times, so at age 16, 18, and 20, or 18, 20, 22, they had a reduction in IQ of about 8 points. So that's hard to do. And all these bars show it if you control for, this top bar is in the whole cohort. In this one, they excluded people who had used cannabis in the past 24 hours. The next one, they excluded people who had used cannabis in the past week. The next one, they excluded people who had tobacco dependence, hard drug dependence, alcohol dependence. Essentially didn't change things much. Those who had 3 diagnoses of marijuana dependence, so that's heavy use and sustained use, starting in adolescence, had a major drop in their IQ, and is less of an effect if they had marijuana dependence at 2 time points, and less of an effect if they had marijuana dependence at 1 time point. By and large, these are significant reductions, okay, compared to those who used but never had a diagnosis and those who never used. So this is a longitudinal cohort. These are the same kids evaluated over time. So by those who never used had basically this is a non-significant change, but it certainly didn't go down. Those who the heaviest users had a reduction in their IQ. So this is one study. It would be great to see it replicated. There's a lot we don't know, but this does not make reassured for the fact, when I hear people say that it's natural, it doesn't have any bad effects on kids. So what was interesting, very interesting, is those who began marijuana use later in life. So if they started started after the teen year, so after age 21, they had no reduction in IQ. And the IQ decline persisted after discontinuation of marijuana use. So there was a subsample who at age 38 had quit using for 10 years. Those folks also had a decline in IQ, which led the authors to postulate that the findings are suggestive of essentially a neurotoxic effect of cannabis on the adolescent brain. And they went on to talk about the importance of prevention and policy efforts specifically targeting adolescents. So this is essentially a summary slide. Basically, I just presented 3 studies. This is a summary slide. This is not just in adolescents, but a sort of selection of reasonably well-done studies and their findings on cognitive function, reduction in IQ in a few studies, attention, executive functioning, and then changes in brain structure and changes in brain function. Okay, so there's PET studies, fMRI studies, that sort of thing. So essentially, IQ, attention, and memory are what we're seeing for cognition. So I'm going to move on and talk a bit about other parts of the brain, the reward regions in the brain that subserve addiction. So I'll start with an animal study because it's not cross-sectional. If you give THC to rodents, you see growth of neurons in the nucleus accumbens. And people say, well, growth, isn't that good? That's dementia, you see shrinking of the brain, alcohol toxicity, you see shrinking of the brain. But this is growth of neurons in the nucleus accumbens, and I think it's quite interesting, but it may represent a kind of learning in the reward region, which, in addiction, our major problem really isn't getting people to attain initial abstinence. It's preventing relapse. It's preventing sort of use again and again, and which may be subserved by the sort of brain changes that this may represent. So this is a study by Jody Gilman, who will give the second part of the talk. So I shouldn't be showing her data, but so correct me if I'm wrong here. But Jody found in young adults in Greater Boston who didn't have marijuana dependence but used regularly, I think on average of certainly less than once a day and less than one joint per occasion. So they were occasional users. A change in the nucleus accumbens similar to what was shown in that animal study. So these this is nucleus accumbens, and this is essentially increased density of brain tissue in this brain region, which correlated with use. In the same study, she showed a deformation in the amygdala in young marijuana users versus controlled, which also was associated with frequency and heaviness of use. So this is a cross-sectional study, but we feel that this is relevant, particularly given these associations. And so essentially the most severe expression of problem drug use, which is we call addiction, is associated with changes in the brain, in the basal ganglia, the extended amygdala, and prefrontal cortex, which collectively sort of are called the reward system. These changes sort of help explain why individuals with addictions are unable to stop using drugs despite the negative effects on their health and well-being, and why we really want to prevent onset of addiction. So this is very new. We want to see, does this hold up in a larger sample? The Human Connectome project just had data become available in the past couple of months, and we plotted essentially nucleus accumbens volume with numbers of time used in their lifetime. And this sample was 25 to 35 years old. Yeah. So over the course of their life, they'd used either no marijuana or over 1,000 times. And here we're seeing similar correlation here with nucleus accumbens volume being bigger in people who used. And this isn't per se adolescent onset, but these are folks at age 25 to 35 who have used some of them over 1,000 times. So this is probably onset in adolescence. And here we just compared those who met criteria for marijuana dependence with those who didn't, just a different way of slicing the data. And again, show the volume is higher in those with dependence compared to those who are not. So that's a structural brain change or a difference between groups. I talk about addiction, and I realize when I talk to groups, they don't, I need to make the point that really a minority of people who use any given drug of abuse becomes addicted to that drug. Okay, so, and you might not realize it, but actually tobacco is the most addictive in terms of the percent of people who use who become addicted. And cannabis is a little confusing. So about 9% of people who ever use cannabis will become addicted. But about 16% of people who use in childhood or in adolescence will become addicted. And anywhere from 35 to 50%, I think the estimate's around 37% now, who use daily will become addicted. So I usually get questions on this slide. No questions? Yes? Right, so if you use daily and then you can stop, that's a great question. So you think daily, pretty soon you'd become addicted, right? Oh, so addiction really is problem use where you have trouble stopping, you have withdrawal symptoms if you stop. So you can use some drugs daily and not become addicted. I mean, a glass of wine a night doesn't make you addicted to alcohol. So you could have a very small amount of cannabis every day, I suppose, but you'd have about a 50%, 25 to 50% chance of becoming addicted. Great question. Yes?
If you could just wait for me to get to you so we can get your questions on the, thank you.
I'm just wondering how the new high-potency cannabis affects the addiction rates.
Right.
This is an older slide.
This is an older slide, although this data point is from a newer study, and that's here. But it's not that much newer. Yeah. So that's a great question. I don't know. And that's the thing, you can't repeat all your studies, so some of what we know is older. This is just a little bit of data in terms of the percent of kids aged 15 to 19 who are seeking treatment. What are they seeking treatment for addictive services? Marijuana is overwhelmingly it's more common than all the others combined. And this I want to take a few minutes on. So this is a study of drug use outcomes in 234 twin pairs who are discordant for marijuana use before age 17. And that means one of them started using before age 17 and the other didn't. And it's looking at the odds ratio or the risk of use or a use disorder of other substances compared to the co-twin, so compared to somebody who's genetically either very similar or identical. So compared to the co-twin who didn't use marijuana before age 17, the person who used marijuana was, I'll go to the use disorders, was 6-fold more likely to become addicted to a sedative, was 5-fold more likely to develop addiction to opioids than their non-using co-twin. So I think this is pretty powerful. Again, it's cross-sectional data, but it's got a genetic control, which I think is quite interesting. I have a question up here.
On this slide and the previous one, I'm looking at the dates, and they seem a little bit old.
Yeah.
And given recent, news, especially about opioids, where would you put those two slides today if you were to update them?
So this is not super old. Oh, I thought I think actually this is a typo. I think this is 2017. Sorry about that. This is recent. This slide, I don't know. This is a difficult study to do, and I would think that with high-potency marijuana available, the news here would not be better today than it was in 15 years ago. And you're right, opioid use is higher as a base rate in society now, so there are more people using, so that may change the odds, but this is a 5-fold increase. So that's enormous. So I think an increase in societal use wouldn't bring that down terribly much. Yeah. Yes? I can repeat your question, too.
Again, but I'm going to like scream into this microphone. What is an example that when you're saying sedatives, is that alcohol? Like what is an example of sedatives?
So I think that would be benzodiazepines in this population. Yeah, I don't think alcohol's in this group. I can repeat your question.
Thank you. Two medical questions. You talked about, competitive THC competes with antibiotic receptors, and because of the affinity, sort of knocks them off and has an effect. Is there a downregulation to the receptors?
Not that I know of. This is a receptor system that I'm learning more and more about all the time. So it's, there's the reverse. I think it's getting into too much neurobiology, but I can talk to you afterwards. Yeah.
Other question, you talked about neurotoxicity. Is there actually volume loss in the area that justifies IQ drop?
We're seeing gain in volume in cerebellum, in nucleus accumbens. Jody, do you know? Hippocampal volume loss. So that could underscore cognitive changes. Yeah. So there are two studies that I want to sort of pique your interest on. I'm going to move ahead just in service of getting through. Two studies that I think are very interesting, and this is an animal study showing that if you give an animal THC, you increase the addictiveness essentially of nicotine. And I'll show you later in the talk, if you give an animal nicotine, you increase the addictiveness of cocaine. And this is a behavioral study. That study it shows DNA unwrapping, DNA expression, and use. And it fits with, just as a brief way of mentioning, it fits what we're learning from polygenic risk scores for addiction, in which some clusters of genes seem to put people at risk for specific addictions, and Jody will talk more about this. And some genes put people at risk for across addictions, across drugs of abuse. So that's predisposition. But drug use seems to also cause brain changes. So genes really aren't destiny, which is good news. I'm going to move on to motor and movements and cannabis. These are pictures of the cerebellum showing differences between heavy cannabis users and controls in terms of cerebellar volume. And here, glucose metabolism in the cerebellum is much reduced in heavy marijuana user compared to normals. And here's essentially a whole brain scan. And it's just to really remind me to talk about, I think one of the major risks for kids, but granted the data are in whole populations, in that marijuana intoxication does seem to double the risk of motor vehicle accidents. This is essentially a meta-analysis showing the results of individual studies and then a pooled risk, which is a doubling of the risk for a crash. And then in this, you should see types of studies, and here you see the risk for fatal collisions is a bit higher than twice. And I had mentioned changes in potency. This has been reported as far back, for the past sort of 10, 15 years, that actually increase cannabis THC concentrations are being found in drivers in accidents, in motor vehicle accidents, in aviation accidents. And we do know that cannabis significantly affects driving. I mean, increase overall risk of a crash, not as much as alcohol by any means. Alcohol puts your risk up about 7-fold of crashing your car. But if you combine alcohol and tobacco and cannabis, it's actually seems to be even worse than either alone. So people slow down rather than speeding up, but they're unable to react to unexpected events, particularly when you get 2 or more unexpected events together. Marilyn Hustis, a sort of an expert in the world, says, well, they're able to stop when the old person walks out into the road to cross the street, but when that person drops their keys, they hit them. So it's that sort of thing. It's trying to process multiple unusual things. And this is some early data out of Colorado showing a spike in crashes compared to 34 states without medical marijuana. These are low numbers, and so it's an unstable sort of, you see this is every 6 months, but it's going from about 5% of fatal crashes to about 10%. And Colorado, Washington, I don't have their fatal car crashes, but their prevalence of having THC positive in samples went up by 50% in the 2 years after they had legalization. So there's more marijuana in drivers apparently after legalization. This isn't necessarily kids. This is the whole population. So just have one slide. This could be a whole talk. Linda Lisi from Lincoln is really an expert here. She's here in the front row. But cannabis does have a relationship to mental illness, and this is from a couple of sources. The National Academy of Sciences did a nice report on essentially medical marijuana, but they reviewed the literature on the impact of marijuana use on psychiatric illness, because it's often being used as a treatment for psychiatric illness, but what they actually found is there's a significant relationship with onset of schizophrenia, with anxiety and depressive disorders, and with completed suicide. And adolescent risk, adolescent onset increases that risk. So essentially heavier use, greater drug potency, and exposure at a younger age, for example, is associated with earlier age of onset of psychosis, with worse course of the disease, et cetera. This is a slide from Sharon Levy, who's my wonderful colleague from Boston Children's Hospital, just showing the impact on schools, on suspensions after the legalization of medical marijuana in Colorado. So suspensions spiked from about 3,300 to, in the 4,000s, and also expulsions went up a bit from 500 to sort of 700, and now start coming down. So what they're seeing is more use in kids, and actually more arrests of people of color, young people of color, because it's still illegal to possess under the age of 21. So best intentions there didn't seem to be bearing out. So the amount of marijuana used between age 14 to 21 is associated with poorer outcomes across the board. Percent of people on welfare goes up, the percent of people unemployed. Personal income is lower, as is the percentage of people getting a university degree. This is across multiple studies, and some of them are fairly recent and some are 15 years old. All drugs of abuse are associated with poor school performance. So this is initiating use before, age of dropout, initiating after. And this is past month use, self-reported in kids 12 to 17 by medical marijuana legalization. And so here you see New England very well represented. I think you've got Vermont, Massachusetts, New Hampshire. But so just a nod to sort of availability. And these are some actual photographs from Colorado, what's on the shelves. I've got lots of these. This is actually, I've seen one of these in town. This is a Juul pod filled with THC oil. I just learned what Juuls are. I don't know. So Juuling is apparently very common here. You can hide them in your hand. Most of the kids, my daughter's a sophomore, they don't think smoking tobacco is a good thing at all, but Juuling is pretty common. You can Juul in class, apparently, hold it in your hand, inhale, and then blow it down your hoodie. That's happening. It's funny, I was in New York this past fall speaking to a wonderful expert from London in e-cigarette use, et cetera, and he told me that nobody uses e-cigarettes who wasn't already a smoker. And I asked him, well, what age does your survey start? And he's like, well, it's in adults, 22 and above. And I literally came home and asked my daughter, and she sort of reeled off 30, 40 names of kids who are using e-cigarettes. And so I emailed him, and he said, oh, but they're just probably using flavors. And so I asked her, why would you just juul flavors? They're juuling nicotine. So anyway, we're actually starting to study this. Adolescent nicotine exposure does have long-term effects. So certainly using an e-cigarette is less dangerous than smoking tobacco in terms of all the cardiovascular effects. But in adolescence, e-cigarette use is associated with increased use of smoking actual tobacco. So those who'd ever used e-cigarettes had 3.5 times higher odds of trying cigarettes versus those who'd never used. And if you'd used in the past 30 days, you had 4 times greater chances of smoking in the future. Heavy e-cigarette users progress to heavier smoking. So that's really the main risk. That and this possibility of the effect on the brain, the sort of the gateway hypothesis effect on the brain of making other substances more addictive. This is a very nice PET study from some friends of mine at Yale showing the nicotinic receptor occupancy with smoking a cigarette and with a high nicotine e-cigarette, a medium nicotine e-cigarette, and an e-cigarette with no nicotine. So it's acting in the brain at nicotinic receptors like cigarettes. This just came out. And the flavors are unbelievable. These are clearly being marketed to kids. So in order here, you've got cool cucumber, creme brulee, mango fruit, I guess this is mint, and then tobacco flavored. So these are, and there's about 7,000 flavors sort of for people who are studying this that are described. This is a really important marketing tool for e-cigarettes. It increases the perception that they're safe, apparently, to kids. And astonishingly, well, actually maybe not astonishingly, 30% of adolescents report not knowing what's in their e-cigarettes. So maybe they're starting for the flavor, and maybe it has nicotine in it, maybe it doesn't. So you may get progression when you don't even know it. So a few myths, and I'm going to turn this over to Jody. Kids who juul don't get addicted or don't use tobacco. It's about 3 to 4-fold increased risk for using tobacco. A recent study, I was just, the nicotine meetings were just last week in Baltimore, and there are 4 big trials on the effects of e-cigarette use in adolescents and the impact on tobacco use. And what was really interesting is the Canadian study, the COMPAS study, showed relevant to this group, that amongst people who say that they would never use tobacco, that there's considered at low risk for using tobacco, those are the ones who had the greatest increase in their risk for uptake if they used e-cigarettes. So it's interesting. Kids are only juuling flavors. It sounds like over 40% are using nicotine. Myth, marijuana is not addictive. In fact, 25 to 50% who do use daily become addicted, and about 16% who start in adolescence become addicted. And marijuana reduces alcohol and opiate use. This is a really popular one. In fact, very nice data are that youth that use marijuana are significantly more likely to use opiates and alcohol. And this I was take a few minutes with before I turn it over to Jody. So essentially, drugs affect the brain, and this is I think is a beautiful study by Aaron Levine from Eric Kandel's lab in New York. This is biologic evidence for what's been described in epidemiologic studies for a long time of a gateway drug hypothesis. And that's what we've known for a long time, that kids who start using tobacco at 12 are more likely to start using alcohol by 15, or more likely to use hard drugs by their 20s. But who knows if that was due to their socioeconomic status or their peer group or whatever. This is showing in essentially genetically identical animals, those who had nicotine first, who were then exposed to cocaine, had more rapid histone deacetylase inhibition, so basically unwrapping of DNA, immediate early gene expression, which is associated with addiction, something called long-term potentiation attenuation. Again, this is a measure at the synapse in the brain, and then they behaviorally they went to the compartment where they'd gotten the drug. So they showed that they wanted to get the drug, and so if they got nicotine first, cocaine was more addictive. And cocaine doesn't need a lot of help being addictive, but this did accelerate the process. So drugs do affect the brain. So I'm going to introduce Jody Gilman, who's the director of neuroscience at our department and who trained at NIAAA in Brown, got her PhD there and spent at MGH for 6 years? Yeah.
I know it's late and we're tired. I won't take up very much of your time, but I do want to touch upon alcohol because that is the most common drug that is used other than tobacco, and it is very, very commonly used among kids. So alcohol has been around forever, and the ancient empires were very worried about teen alcohol use, believe it or not. There were ancient warnings about the dangers of alcohol. Plato said no use under the age of 18. He said between 18 and 30, use alcohol in moderation. But then after 40, he said there should be no restrictions. So I guess life expectancy was not what it is today, so he figured people could have fun after the age of 40. He was quite ahead of his time, because now we really know that between 18 and that under the age of 18 is really the worst, and between 18 and 30 is also a vulnerable period. Adolescence has really been extended in brain science. So he knew what he was talking about. So this is a study that I thought was kind of neat. It was conducted in Maine, and I don't think that Massachusetts is that different than Maine. But they did a study where they conducted a student survey with 8th to 12th graders. And they asked them all these questions about alcohol. And then they called their parents. And they asked their parents these questions about their kids' alcohol use. And believe it or not, I know this is going to be shocking to all of you, there was a wide disparity in between what teens say they are doing and what parents believe they are doing. So I won't make anybody raise their hands because, I don't want to embarrass anybody. But think about if you think, is your kid drinking alcohol? Yes or no? Is your kid binge drinking? Yes or no? Just think about in your head what you would say if this person called you on the phone. Well, I have some bad news. Some of you are going to be wrong. So in this survey, 65% of teens reported any lifetime drinking. Only 17% of parents reported that their teens drank any drinks. In the past month, about 40% of teens reported drinking, whereas 2% of parents reported that their teens were drinking. And this one I found most striking, binge drinking. 20% of these kids said they were binge drinking, and I'll get into what binge drinking really is, but that's 5+ drinks in a row. And 0.5%, that's not 5%, that's 0.5%. 0.5% of parents said their kids were binge drinking. So there's a lot that goes on that parents don't know about. Then they went on to say, what should we do about teen alcohol use? And parents are very concerned about this. 83% of parents are very concerned about teen drinking. 99% said it's very inappropriate to use alcohol before the age of 14. 96% said that it's inappropriate to use alcohol before 17. And parents are very much in favor of, at least parents in Maine, strengthening enforcement of underage drinking laws and laws that ban supplying alcohol to minors and things like that. And we know that underage drinking is really a big problem on so many levels, on neurobiological levels, societal levels. It impacts brain structure, brain function, cognitive performance, scholastic achievement, just across all domains. Kids who begin drinking by age 15 are 4 times more likely to develop alcohol use disorders when they're adults. And I'm going to show you a graph of that. And with as little as 1 drink, alcohol can impair normal brain function in adolescents, more so than adults. There's some beautiful animal studies where if you give the same amount of alcohol to an adolescent rat versus an adult rat, the adolescent rat has greater consequences of that use. And actually, the study that I'm thinking of shows that this rat who has the equivalent of 1 drink shows impaired learning and memory for up to 2 weeks, and that doesn't happen to adults. And Eden got into this a little bit with cannabis, but this is even more of a problem with alcohol and driving. Alcohol impairs driving more so than cannabis. However, there's a big public health push to limit alcohol, driving under the influence of alcohol, and there's been really none of that with cannabis. So in our studies, we actually ask people, we bring adolescents and young adults into the lab, and we ask them, how likely are you to drink and drive? People say, no, I would never do that, 0%, it's not gonna happen, I would never drink and drive. We say, how likely is it that you will smoke cannabis and drive? They really think about that. Yeah, I'd probably do that. Maybe 50%. So we see a huge discrepancy, and it's really because we've done a really good job of discouraging drunk driving, and we haven't done the same with drug driving. Finally, alcohol use is very linked to depression, STDs, date rape, all kinds of negative consequences that happen when there's pervasive alcohol around. There's this controversy over the minimum legal drinking age. I mean, so the minimum legal drinking age is 21 in this country. You can do a lot of other things at 18 that you can't do, you know, when you can fight in a war, but you can't have a drink. And people say, well, that is just crazy. But on a policy level, it works in deterring underage drinking. So we still have rampant underage drinking, but the data shows that it would be even worse if the minimum drinking age was lowered. There's studies around the world that have seen that drinking among 18 to 20-year-olds increase with lower drinking age and decrease with higher drinking age. And there's this whole mythology of Europe, how people in Europe don't have alcohol use disorders because it's not a big treat for them and they're exposed to alcohol from a young age and they don't take advantage and they don't binge. That's false. Lots of European teens binge drink. Actually, a majority of European countries, a greater percentage of 15 to 16-year-olds report drinking to excess compared to the US. So that's not really an argument that plays out very well. And a lot of factors influence drinking patterns across Europe and the US, government policies, tax availability, cultural values, and things like that. So what percentage of the population would you say are drinkers? You can just yell it out. Does anyone have any idea? Very close. Very close. 71%. However, so most people drink, but not everybody. 30% of people just don't drink ever. 73% of the alcohol is consumed by only 10% of the population. So there's a few people who drink a lot of alcohol. It's quite amazing when you think about it. And again, a standard drink is 12 ounces of beer, 5 ounces of wine, 1.5 ounces of spirits. So just keep that in mind when you're at a bar or when you're pouring your drinks, that a drink should really be a shot of alcohol. Now I'm going to briefly touch on high-risk drinking patterns. So there's binge drinking, which is drinking too much too fast. And the NIAAA has defined this as 5+ drinks per occasion for males and 4+ for females, but obviously there's variability. And then there's heavy drinking, which is too much too often. So those are frequent binge episodes per week. And there's consequences to both. For binge drinking, you have unintentional death and injury, homicide, violence, even suicide goes up when people have been drinking. And then there's chronic consequences of heavy drinking, like alcohol use disorder and pancreatitis and things. And I'm not going to get into this. Somebody asked what the definition of addiction was. And lay people often think that it's about the amount you use. So addiction is when you need a drink every single day, or addiction is when you drink this many drinks per week. It's actually a criteria, it's a psychological criteria where we ask these questions and we see how many things people endorse. So failure to fulfill major role obligations at work or school is a criteria of addiction. Recurrent alcohol use in situations where it's physically hazardous is a criteria of an addiction. So what we do is we would ask people these questions and we would count up the responses and we could classify people as having a mild, a moderate, or a severe alcohol use disorder. So this is something that you should be very aware of in your, if you're worried about your children, you can look at this list and see, are they endorsing these characteristics? And a lot of people in the US have alcohol use disorders. About 14% of the adult population met criteria for an alcohol use disorder in the past year, and about 30% had met criteria for an alcohol use disorder at some point in their lifetime. And that's huge. That's almost 1 in 3. This counts alcohol abuse, which is, we don't use that term anymore because we've changed the way we classify alcohol use disorders. And anyone who has been to college has probably fulfilled one of the criteria of alcohol abuse. So it's a bit inflated. Most people will sort of outgrow or mature out of some of these, but some people don't, and that's important to keep in mind. Alcohol is the 3rd largest cause of mortality in the US. I mean, that's huge. 88,000 deaths per year attributed to alcohol. There's an opiate crisis going on in the US, which is very real. And that has about 40,000, is that right? About lower, 30,000 deaths per year. So there is an opiate epidemic. There's also an alcohol epidemic in this country. We just don't talk about it in the same way. So that's just important to keep in mind, that alcohol really does kill people. So I'm just going to go through this quickly. This is just the epidemiology of alcohol use disorder. And what you can see is this mild, moderate, severe that I talked about is most prevalent in young people. This is starts in adulthood, so it doesn't go into people under the age of 18, but it peaks at around 18 to 29, but it would look similar to this if I went back in age. More males than females will have alcohol use disorders. Really pretty consistent across races and ethnicities. Asians are a little bit less likely for genetic reasons, which I'm happy to talk about later. Education level. People have alcohol use disorders across education levels. College educated, non-college educated, it doesn't matter. And then income levels, you see a little bit of a linear trend where lower income people are more likely to have alcohol use disorders, but again, this is pretty stable. So it really is a disorder that can affect anybody. There's a ton of medical consequences to alcohol use disorder. On the brain, on the gastrointestinal system, cardiovascular system, it leads to cancer. It can lead to fetal alcohol syndrome if you're drinking while pregnant. And these are some brain scans that I did when I was at NIAAA, and the top is an alcoholic woman who has enlarged ventricles. She has cerebral atrophy in the frontal lobe. This is not what the brain is supposed to look like. It's supposed to look like this. So you can even see, from 40 feet away, you can see that brain doesn't look quite right. So, average age of first drink is 11 years old for boys and 13 years old for girls. So people start very early. Now this is the first full drink. This isn't a sip. This is the first time they have a drink. It doesn't mean that it's common. It doesn't mean that they develop this with any pattern or frequency, but this is really young for drinking a whole drink. There has been an increase in alcohol use among adolescents. So 30 to 50% of students report drinking alcohol in the past month, and over 20% of 12th graders report binge drinking in the past month. Underage drinking accounts for about 17% of total alcohol expenditures. This is from 2001, so it's a little bit outdated. But I don't think much has changed. So while the legal landscape has really changed around cannabis, where there's more acceptance of cannabis, use is rising, alcohol is pretty stable. So we can look at data from the past, and most of it is still relevant. The final thing that I want to say about alcohol is that adolescents drink less frequently than adults, but drink more drinks per occasion when they do drink compared to adults. So these are people who are underage. They drink about 6 days per month, and then young adults 21 to 25 drink about 8 days per month, and adults drink about 9 days per month. But when they drink, underage people 12 to 20, they drink about 5 drinks when they drink, which is a lot of drinks. Whereas young adults drink about 4, and then older adults drink 2 to 3 drinks when they drink, which still sounds high to me, but that's what people do. And I'm not going to get into this because Eden really got into what addiction is and how you can go from a recreational drug use to an addiction. But this is quite interesting. This is a graph showing risk factors for alcohol dependence. And as you can see, this age of first alcohol use is extremely predictive of who will develop an alcohol use disorder. This top line are people who are family history positive. So if you are family history positive and you are having your first drink at age 13, your prevalence of alcohol use disorders is almost 60%. So it's quite striking. And then family history negative means that there's no history of alcoholism in your family. And if you start at 13, you're still at a high risk. You're still at about 28%. And then as your age increases, so if you can wait longer before having your first drink, your risk goes way down. And the difference between family history positive and negative gets a little bit smaller. Does that make sense? Does anyone have any questions about that? So there's also other risk factors such as years of drinking, years of heavy drinking, and the level of response to alcohol. There's a really interesting field of study where you can give people drinks and measure how much they like the drink, how sensitive they are to its rewarding effects, how sensitive they are to the sedative effects of alcohol, which is protective, and you can predict who develop an alcohol use disorder. It's very interesting. So just your response to the drug is a risk factor for developing an alcohol use disorder. So this is kind of fun to show people. These are blood alcohol concentration curves. Whoops. And so we usually say 1 drink an hour. You can have a drink and an hour later you can drive totally fine. That's not quite true. So if you have a drink, this is 1 drink right here, and this is the time that it takes to eliminate that alcohol from your system. So it'll take about 2 hours. This is 2 drinks. It'll take about 4 hours. 3 drinks, and this is 4 drinks. So if you have 4 drinks, you're probably at about a 0.08. This is 80 milligram percent, which is a 0.08, and you're really impaired for a long time, more than 4 hours. You're not really back down to 0 until around 7 hours later. So if you go out drinking and then you go to sleep at night, you can wake up and you can still feel drunk. That is a thing. It's not all that uncommon if somebody is a heavy binge drinker. The other thing I'll say about this, our legal limit is 0.08. 0.08 is 4 consecutive drinks. So I think our legal limit is quite high for alcohol. If you can think about what you're like after 4 drinks, most people should not be walking, let alone driving. And this is just another demonstration of alcohol's pharmacodynamics. So if you're at a 0.2, you're feeling a little happy, your muscles are relaxing. At 0.05, you have more relaxation. Your reaction time is going up, so it's taking you longer to react to things. Muscle coordination is going down. At 0.08, you have a decreased balance. Your speech is impaired. Vision, hearing, coordination. This is the peak of euphoria also. And then at 0.1, you have some gross impairment of physical and mental control, and it goes up from there. At 0.35, you would be unconscious or in a deep coma, unless you have a very, very high tolerance to alcohol, which we saw on some of the inpatient studies that we did, where people would come in at a 0.4 and be walking and talking, and that's really scary. So this is, we say that alcohol has a biphasic effect. So it acts as a stimulant on the increasing limb of the blood alcohol curve and a sedative effect on the decreasing limb of the blood alcohol curve. So when you start drinking, you feel really happy and energized, and then you peak, and then you get really tired. So that's a real thing. I'm sure people are familiar with that. And this is a 0.08. So this is a blood alcohol curve. Tolerance can shift that. So if you develop a tolerance to alcohol, it will take more. So tolerance is actually quite important because it's a criteria for alcohol dependence. And it makes sense. The more tolerant you are, the more you will drink to get the feeling that you want. And this can maintain or aggravate alcohol dependence. So these biphasic effects of alcohol are affected by a lot of different factors: genetics, medication, drinking history, tolerance, rate of drinking, age, family history, ethnicity. I mean, there's so many factors that go into how you or your child will respond to alcohol. So just because, it's very dangerous because you could be trying to keep up with a friend. Oh, he had 5 drinks and he was fine. You are not going to have the same response to alcohol as somebody else in the room. And we don't even understand all the factors that play into alcohol pharmacokinetics because it's quite complex. So if this is, again, getting into the neuroscience of addiction. So addiction happens in this cycle where first you would drink or use any drugs for pleasure. And this is called the binge intoxication phase. So people will start drinking alcohol because it's fun to drink alcohol, and they have a good time, and they like it, and they're euphoric, and they're with friends. But after a while, they would progress to something called the withdrawal and negative affect phase, where they're not drinking for fun, they're drinking to relieve negative symptoms. They feel really badly if they don't drink. So they're drinking just to maintain a level of normalcy, because they will go into withdrawal if they don't have access to alcohol, or they'll just feel terrible if they don't have alcohol. And that's very dangerous. And the final cycle of addiction is called the preoccupation or anticipation stage, where the individual becomes absolutely obsessed with obtaining the drug. It's all they can think about. This is when they give up their jobs, their families. They're really at what we call, their rock bottom, and all they can think about is the drug. And that can happen with any drug. That can happen with any drug of abuse. And each of these phases of the addiction cycle is associated with differences in the structure and function of specific brain regions. So now we can really point to the brain regions that are affected at each stage of this cycle. And this is the same thing. Okay, so in the final slides, a lot of times people ask me about genetics of alcoholism. So I have an alcoholic in my family, do I have to worry? Well, yes. So the answer is yes. So alcoholism is very complex. It's a genetically influenced disorder. So that doesn't mean that if your father is an alcoholic, you will become an alcoholic. That is not what that means. It just means that you are more likely. So it's a risk factor like being exposed, being trauma exposed, or as Eden was talking about earlier, having a psychiatric history. So there's a lot of risk factors for alcoholism, but genes do place an individual at high or low risk. Now, then environmental factors interact with genes to determine overall risk. So if you are brought up in an amazing environment and you have resources and you have a great support system, you will probably be fine. If you're family history positive and you grow up in an impoverished environment without any resources and you start drinking at an early age, you likely will not be fine. And we can look at, family studies, and family studies have shown that the risk for alcoholism is 5 times higher in relatives of alcoholics. And we can do these interesting twin studies. An identical twin of an alcoholic is at higher risk than a fraternal twin. So even though they're raised together, whether they're fraternal or identical, the twins that share the same genes are more likely to share alcoholism. And then you can look at adoption studies, where you can look at kids who have parents who were alcoholics but who were adopted by other families, and they still have higher risk for alcohol dependence. And then you can do these fancy association studies and linkage studies where you can really look at this in a sophisticated way. So just to wrap up, what we think are that genes are half the story and the environment is half the story. There are very specific genes that confer risk for alcoholism, but then there's peer influence, stress, availability of resources, childhood abuse, things that happen in your environment that can make you more likely to develop an alcohol use disorder. And this final slide really sums it up, where you have these gene by environment interactions. So you can have early life adverse events. You can have parental alcoholism. You can have parental rejection. You can be abused, things like that. And then there are these gene vulnerabilities where you can have all the right genes that will predispose you to alcoholism. And then the genes and the environmental influences can interact, and that would give you some output. So you could have antisocial behavior, or you could have oppositional disorder because of this combination, and that could lead to drug use. And there's all kinds of mediating factors. Something that I'm very interested in are peer influences in drug use, and we know that most drug use, or at least initially, occurs in social settings, and peer groups tend to mirror each other's drug and alcohol use patterns. parental supervision, drinking opportunities, price, availability. There's just a whole myriad of components that go into the likelihood that somebody will develop one of these disorders. If all these factors come together in a complete wrong way, then you would have, problem drinking and alcoholism. So it takes a lot, and there's a lot of levels where you can intervene and you can have a more positive outcome. So I'll end on an optimistic note that there's a lot that we know about alcohol. There's a lot we know that can be done to prevent alcohol use disorders, especially if you intervene early. Brief interventions work very well in an adolescent age group. And we know a lot about the neuroscience of alcoholism, so we have a really good grasp of the brain regions that are underlying these vulnerabilities. So I'm sorry if I took up a lot of your time, but I will stop here, and thank you so much. Yeah?
Hello?
Hi.
I was wondering, so a lot of these studies cite self-reported statistics from teenagers. And I was wondering, in the case of underage self-reporting, how honest do we think the teens in question are, despite the anonymity? And do paper survey and live interview results have the same results? So are those equally honest there?
So that's an excellent question. And with our studies, we bring these adolescents into the lab, and we swear we will not tell your parents unless there is, a reporting requirement if somebody is, suicidal or homicidal or something like that. We say we will not tell your parents. So we do everything we can to get honesty out of these kids. And a good study will do that. A good study will try to reassure these kids to the best of their abilities that being honest is the best way to go, and this information won't be disclosed. But you're right, it's always a risk. Even for adults, they don't always tell the truth.
Well, I remember the paper study that they had us fill out back in high school. That got a variety of creative results from the students in question. So thank you.
Sure. Won't make you run around too much. There's one there and one there.
I'm just wondering, you had results or research regarding the central nervous system disorders that came with alcoholism, and I know we've had a lot more research on that, but are you showing, I heard about damage or lack of development of the myelins and myelin sheath and all of that. Are you showing the similar results with marijuana use in regards to dementia and other central nervous system dysfunctions?
It's very different. So I will say one thing that separates the alcohol literature and the marijuana literature. There's an entire institute at the National Institutes of Health devoted to studying alcoholism. Alcohol is very well studied. We have very well characterized all the consequences from alcohol use. Alcohol is very widely used and well studied, so we have that all mapped out. Marijuana use is a little bit harder. There aren't great long-term studies that get at long-term consequences of marijuana use. Eden just presented the best that there is, but even those are less conclusive than alcohol studies. So do we see the same problems with alcohol and marijuana use? I would say probably not, but we don't really have a good grasp on all of the brain consequences of marijuana use yet. We're trying to get there. We're doing huge longitudinal studies to look at people before and after they start using marijuana.
One other question. When you speak about marijuana and mental health disorders like schizophrenia and things, are we talking about an earlier onset for people that are already predisposed, or are we talking about onset that is otherwise may not have occurred?
That's a great question. So we're pretty clear that people aren't self-medicating. People who already have schizophrenia are probably not self-medicating. We're pretty sure it's not a combination of alcohol plus cannabis plus tobacco that's causing it. And we're also pretty clear that cannabis use and schizophrenia really aren't both caused by a common factor. It's really more likely that cannabis use may cause schizophrenia in people who are at risk of schizophrenia, that they're vulnerable genetically or otherwise, and the cannabis use may trigger the actual expression. Either that or they both make both the genetics and the cannabis exposure make individual, but probably small, contributions to the risk of actually expressing the disorder. They're like, 30 risk factors for schizophrenia, month of birth, age of your mother, age of your father, all these risks, and they each contribute a small amount. But these are the two that are that we think have the most evidence.
Thank you.
Hi, quick question regarding the schizophrenia. Because we know that the United States hasn't been able to study the use of cannabis and conducting really too many studies here in U.S. Now, the cannabis that was studied with patients that were showing schizophrenia, was this a clean cannabis? Or because use of cannabis in U.S. up to now was illegal, so there were things that were mixed in. So does that mean that those impurities are causing this, or is this, medical grade marijuana that is causing it? And also a second question follow-up, are you guys using the studies that are coming from Israel and Denmark that they've been studying marijuana that has been legal, and are you guys bringing that also across to sort of educate us, the parents, what to expect?
So the best data on risk for schizophrenia in early exposure to cannabis are the Swedish conscript studies, the New Zealand study. There are two out of New Zealand, one out of Australia, one out of Israel. So these are not in the U.S. It's the big population-based studies, which really were the early signals that there was a strong link. There are now, 40,000 people studied is the average size of some of these studies. And no, we certainly aren't using medical, it's not medical grade cannabis, whatever even that is. I guess you can get cannabis now from the NIDA drug supply program in Mississippi. But no, this is whatever people are getting in whatever country they're living in. Yeah.
To my knowledge, so the question was, in countries with different minimum drinking ages, like Germany is 16, Canada is 18, the US is 21, do we have a decreased rate of binge drinking compared to these other countries? And I think we do. I think there's, I don't know if it's significant. I know it bounces around a lot from year to year, and I think we're all pretty comparable. I mean, teenagers throughout the world abuse alcohol.
The question is alcohol, generally diseases that connects to alcohol.
Oh, diseases.
And alcohol use disorders in general. Is it different in U.S. than?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure about that, actually. I would imagine that that is correlated with years of heavy drinking more so than when a person starts drinking. Things like medical consequences of alcohol use disorders are really caused by many, many years of harmful drinking. But yeah, I'm just not sure. Yeah, I just don't know the answer. That would be an interesting study, though.
You had mentioned interventions and what those could look like and that they could have meaningful impact. So as parents, to reassure us as we're leaving tonight, what could be some of those interventions?
Oh, that's a great question. I actually had a slide on that I took out. So there's a lot of different philosophies about parental engagement, and I don't know, Eden, I have a 1-year-old and a 3-year-old, so I don't, I haven't had to deal with this yet, but you might be able to speak to this. But what I think the common sort of wisdom is now is to talk to your kids early and often about this. So if there's a social event, talk to them before the social event and after the social event. Keep an ongoing dialogue. set limits, but I think there's a word for this, and again, you're probably more able to speak to this than me, but there's a way of setting limits. I think more permissive parents there's studies that show that more permissive parents have kids who have more drinking problems. That said, being a more restrictive parent with an open dialogue, I think is what research shows works best.
Yeah. And this, it's a data-driven world now. The kids have access to data, and so sharing with them real truths of real consequences in terms of your family history of a substance use disorder. It's super common. Most of us will have a family member, and so the closer, showing them age of onset is a great line. It's worth the wait. Just waiting a little bit, a couple of years before regular use starts, really changes their risk, really changes impact on their brain development. You can show them pictures. I'll send you my slides. To show them really the data, that it's not moralistic, that I would be happy to stand up here and tell you that none of these had no problem, party on, great. But that's just not the data. So, that I think is worth doing these days. You can send them to websites to show them pictures of brains, and they're different. But if you start at 20 or 18 or 25, the risk is really different. And the other thing, something that Paul Barrera, who's a friend of mine, and he's been the head of student health at Harvard for a long time, did, which was to advertise the actual prevalence of use. So he did something a bit like the parent study that Jody described, but had the opposite result. So he asked all the kids, how much do they use? And what's your perception of what the prevalence is? They all thought that about 80 to 90% of Harvard College kids drink on a regular basis. And actually, it's half. Half of kids, it's high in certain subcultures. The athletics program have real binge drinking issues. But really finding out, in the high school, it's not a majority of kids who are using, and so it's normative to not drink in high school, and really sharing that. And certainly there's certain subcultures where it is normative, and that's where you need to know, whether it's the drama kids who are smoking pot or the soccer players who are smoking pot or drinking on, that's where the communication is important, because those kids, it'll be normative for kids who are in those subcultures.
On a question on treatment, do you have any evidence-based indications about medicine or nutritional approach kind of to fight heavy usage of marijuana, especially, And second, do you have any intervention programs like, AA or something like that specific for heavy usage of marijuana?
There certainly are 12-step programs. Those are great. So there are no treatments that I know of that are effective for marijuana use disorder in terms of medications, but certainly there are 12-step programs. We have the ARMS program, the Addiction Recovery Management Service at MGH, that focuses on essentially 15 to 25-year-olds, transitional age youth, where they have a very good track record of getting kids sort of back into school, back into their lives. And most of those kids are using multiple drugs, so alcohol, opiates, cannabis, yeah.
I have a question, actually. The changes to the brain that you talk about, are they reversible? Like,
So there are some. So with the caveat, we don't know. There's so many factors that go into that: the amount used, the duration used, the potency used, how old they were when they started. But we know that the brain recovers quite well. So there was a really nice study on alcoholics in an inpatient unit who had been drinking for 18, 20, 25 years, and within 1 month, they had substantial brain recovery when they abstain from alcohol. So the brain has an amazing capacity to recover. We don't know how long it takes. There are some slides, there's some studies that Nora Volkow, who's the head of National Institute on Drug Abuse, did where she scanned people who were addicted to cocaine. And it took about 2 years for brain receptors to normalize. So it takes a long time, and that's why people are very vulnerable to relapse in that first 6 months and first year, because their brain is still injured. So it does take time, but the brain is capable of amazing recovery.
But you can't get those IQ points back.
That was interesting. Yeah. And that's one study, but we don't know, the pictures we can take of the brain are on a gross level, right? So we can see structure, we can see some metabolism, but we can't see a lot of what's going on. So we see recovery. I think a number of the studies show recovery. I mean, the best studies go out to only 100 days, and they're looking better. They're not looking normal. Yeah. I mean, I think in general, we don't know enough. We don't know what we need to know. But now here's the
In
expert
response
here.
to a previous question, I've been involved in trying to develop a drug for cannabis dependence. There's an enzyme called fatty acid amide hydrolase that hydrolyzes an anandamide. And so Cyril D'Souza at Yale has done a clinical trial. And now NIDA is actually funding that to make it a multi-center trial. So there is activities now. Unfortunately, the big pharmaceutical companies it's hard to get funding or get, so something needs to change there, but at least there are trials ongoing and it's shown some effects.
I'm not aware of anything that's out there, and it's tough to study. So needing a multi-center trial with the commonness of cannabis use, we're not able to find many who want to quit, right? It's not, it's not a problem. I think it's the...
Uh-oh, that's a big one. Your exercise.
I was a little nervous talking about anandamide with you in the room, actually.
Hi. I was curious, I think you breezed over it a little bit, but you made a statement about the direct correlation between marijuana use and opioid use, and you quoted some study, but you didn't quote the study, you just said the fact. And I was wondering if you knew what the study was. And then the other second part of that is, because the opioid issue is such a crisis, we didn't talk about OxyContin or any of these pharmaceuticals that are leading people down this path versus, pot. So I'm just curious if there's been any similar research studies that you're using when you're doing these presentations, because I'm not sure the illicit world is the only culprit here, the pharmaceuticals.
No, I was asked to talk about these three drugs of abuse. So there's actually growing literature. I think there's such a need for treatments and alternatives to fentanyl and opiates. And so it makes such a compelling story that, kids can use pot instead, or people can use pot instead for their pain, et cetera. And there's a growing literature of high-quality studies that show this is not what happens. So a nice study just came out 2 months ago. Olfson's the first author, showing that if you use cannabis for pain, or if you're using it essentially for fun, 2 years later, your risk of having opiate use or having an opiate use disorder is much higher, significantly higher. And there was a nice editorial that you sent me today from Addiction. Robert West is one of the authors, really saying it's premature to think about cannabis as an alternate to opiates, and laid out the evidence for that.
And I can say, personally, I just did this huge analysis of 1,400 people, and with every increase in cannabis use, incrementally, there was incrementally more use of every other substance: alcohol, tobacco, opiates, other illicit drugs. So I just don't see the substitution playing out in the people we study. It would be great, as Eden said, if we could find something that people would substitute for opiates that was less harmful, but I don't think that's going to pan out.
And again, we need to know more, but what we know so far is not reassuring along those lines. Yeah.
I guess that wasn't really my question.
Oh.
Were we studying the effect of opioids
On all these parameters? Oh, sure. Oh, so by no means is marijuana the only way into opiate use. In fact, that's not at all. But it increases the risk. So if you use cannabis, the myth is that, oh, cannabis use will, at least they're not using alcohol, at least they're not using opiates. Well, in fact, if they're using cannabis, they're more likely to use those other drugs, not less. So it's not saying that's to blame, that's the pathway only to opiates. Absolutely not. Your own medicine cabinet is, it's very likely to be the first drug people try these days. So totally agreed. Clear out your own medicine cabinet. That's hopefully your pediatricians have told you that. Please do that. Any old meds from your dentist, get it out of there, because you don't want your kids to try it. Because for some who are susceptible, 4 or 5 uses and they're escalating. So absolutely. Yes.
Hi, so it's not my field, so I'm circling back around on this discussion of marijuana, this population that you're talking about, and then being a gateway drug into something else. Are we talking about the people who are addicted to marijuana, or are we talking about to a population of people who use marijuana will become addicted, or opioid users, or I'm getting lost in the groupings.
What I showed you was just animal studies where animals have been given one drug for 2 weeks. It changed their response to a different drug.
So the one drug for 2 weeks, were you considering those animals addicted during those 2 weeks?
Yeah, again, addiction, I should do that checklist.
Okay.
So
we're just saying users are potentially going to go on to other drugs.
There's something in the brain that's called sensitization, so that if you stimulate neurons by one means, they're more sensitive to another stimulation. So what we think is going on in the brain is that whatever the first drug is sensitizes the brain to the second drug. So the study that Eden showed, the THC sensitized the brain to nicotine. There have been other studies that have shown that with other drugs. So we think it's really a neurobiological mechanism for a potential gateway hypothesis. I don't like the word gateway hypothesis because it's so politically charged, and then I get yelled at. And again, these are all associations that we can measure over time. But I think that these animal studies really hone in on potential mechanisms and why we're seeing that.
Human studies coming out, this has been legal and used in countries like Denmark. Do we have actual studies, human studies, pertaining to this?
About sensitization?
Pertaining to marijuana being a gateway drug, because that's a question that high schoolers actually ask.
So in in human studies, it's very, very, very hard to answer that question conclusively in human studies because you can't randomize people to use cannabis or not use cannabis. So think about smoking and lung cancer. So we can say smoking causes lung cancer. That was about 50 years of, Eden can talk about this more than me. How many studies did it take for us to draw that conclusion?
And the effect is enormous. It increases your risk 6-fold.
With almost everything else, this causes cancer, that causes cancer, this causes, with almost everything else, we just get these associations. So there's huge associations between cannabis use and use of other drugs. I'm not ready to say cannabis use causes the use of other drugs. I can't say that right now, but I like the animal studies because then you can really get at some potential mechanisms.
But there are lots of human studies, and that's the trouble is it's hard to interpret them. It's hard to say cause and effect, whereas in the animal studies, these are genetically identical animals. You randomize and then you see this effect, and so it's much more easy to say cause and effect there, whereas in these great big human studies, well, they're messy, right? Because you don't know if they have family history, so that's why the gateway hypothesis has been so politically charged, and so that's really why I showed a couple of nice, neat, clean animal studies to illustrate that phenomenon.
Well, that's
But
why I
think it's real.
have a question about this, and that's why the kids are coming back with the question. Sorry to take
So
up
yes,
time.
the answer is yes.
Yeah.
The answer is yes.
Because
Early use of one drug, increases risk of early drugs, of other drugs almost interchangeably. Maybe a little cavalier there, but.
But it's also like developmental, right? So cannabinoid receptor is the most abundant receptor in your brain, and you're still developing at age 25. So it just makes sense to me that you're messing with a major GPCR receptor in your brain, and it can have consequences.
So the question is, there are the people that they enter drugs. They're just, they have a different personalities. I don't care what you put in front of them, they'll take it up. So you have patients, pain patients, they come in and they're drug addicts. So whether you give them opioids or you give them cannabis, it's almost the same thing, It doesn't matter what you give them. That's their personality. They have problems in their life, and this is the way they numb themselves. So the question that keeps coming up, actually coming from kids, is like, well, cannabis is not as bad as alcohol because we know, that it's not the gateway. So if there's studies coming out of Europe, I mean, they've used it.
I think that's where the myth is, and it used to be, oh, alcohol's okay, at least it's not opiates, or at least it's not, cocaine. I think that's. I'm not reassured by that. I think that these are sort of false sort of hierarchies. I mean, yes, opiates are far more lethal in overdose. Absolutely, very scary for that reason. Kids coming out of rehab, not without tolerance, are at high risk for sure. But I think there's a fair bit of risk, especially in a community like this where we're paying for SAT preps classes, and we've got sort of high achieving kids, and so you've got kids who are using drugs who are going to impede their ability to learn, impede their ability to have their brains develop, increase addictiveness of other drugs. I think these are all relevant for the kids. So the hierarchies, I would try to debunk that, really. Yeah.
Any other questions? So thank you, everybody, for coming. Really appreciate it. Thank you to both of you. Wonderful presentation.